I call to order this joint hearing of the Eurasian Emerging Threat Subcommittee and the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations for this afternoon's hearing on issues dealing with clean water, sanitation, and the world. So throughout recent hearings, and I want to thank my fellow members here before I begin an opening statement on my part. Thank you both for the contributions you've made to this hearing, but also to this issue over the years. You have both demonstrated such a high level of morality and concern for fellow human beings that will, in and of themselves, those concepts and those part of your soul will serve our country well as in the long run in terms. We do what's right, we do what's good for the world in these ways and make it a better world. It's better, it's clearly going to have very positive feedback and blowback on the United States rather than negative blowback when all we rely on is weapons and trying to get things done by sending troops in the last minute to calm the situation down. So I want to thank you both for your moral and long-term thinking. Throughout recent hearings, the Europe and Eurasian Subcommittee has explored international water cooperation and discussed examples where water disputes between nations has led to increased tensions. And today we will be discussing water from the point of view of human security. Access to clean water is absolutely essential to each and every human being. That is why estimates that potentially billions of people in the coming decades will be living in water-stressed areas of the world. So this is a very troubling observation and prediction. Without access to water and the implications that it holds for personal hygiene, agriculture, industry, far too many people will be forced to accept lower standards of living. As members of Congress concerned with foreign policy, we must think how this dynamic may spark conflicts over natural resources or destabilize very fragile governments. But this is not only a question for the future, it is a problem of today. This year, we know hundreds of thousands of children will needlessly die from diseases caused by a lack of clean water, or plus many more than those hundreds of thousands. Many more will die from some disease that can be traced right back to a lack of clean water. The toll in human suffering caused by a lack of water and dirty water is great, and I am sure witnesses here can explain those stories and how great a problem and challenge that it is. Yet, I believe the challenges of access to clean water, hygiene, and sanitation can be conquered, and we now have it within our grip technologically and with the amount of wealth available in our societies to actually overcome this enormous challenge. Our government, through USAID, has spent over $3.5 billion over the last decade on programs to do just that, not to mention the efforts of our international partners and non-governmental organizations. I believe that as technologically and as we continue to advance technologically and continue to have innovative ideas that we put into practice, that water scarcity can be managed and mitigated. Increasing human security when it comes to water access and hygiene will not only help improve the lives of these millions of vulnerable people, if not billions of people, but also serve as the strategic interests of the United States. If increasing access to clean water at the micro level helps people and communities to be secure, it follows that their governments will be better able to find solutions to international water disputes. So without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional questions and extraneous material. But before that, I'd like to start off with Mr. Blumenauer Well, Mr. Smith, Mr. Blumenauer, who's sort of been our partner on this and several other significant matters. Mr. Blumenauer, would you enlighten us with an opening statement?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for the courtesy of permitting me to join you and Chairman Smith in this hearing, laying an important foundation. This has been an area of deep personal concern of mine. I've been pleased that in recent Congresses, we've been able to get a couple of significant pieces of legislation to focus American foreign policy on water and sanitation. And I would say that there have been no two stronger champions in this bipartisan effort than the two of you. And so I'm deeply appreciative of your leadership and your partnership, and it is truly an honor for me to join you. And you laid it out, Mr. Chairman. We've got some certified smart people here who can round out this picture, who have been active in recent years. I've had a chance to meet some and have a new acquaintance here. But the intersection of water, national security, and massive dilemmas in terms of human well-being are significant. There are 261 waterways that cross international boundaries. In some cases, like the Danube, it's 19 countries in the heart of Europe. An unsettling number of some of the largest rivers in the world no longer flow to the oceans in the course of a year. They are dry for some or all of that period. More than 40% of the world's population already lives in an area of physical water scarcity. And competition is fierce. It's estimated that 20% more irrigation water is going to be needed in the next 10 years to keep agriculture going. The Pacific Institute in California has drawn up a list of conflicts in which water has played a part, and they've identified over 204 such incidents where water figured into international conflict. And 61 of those incidents were recent. It looks like the problem is getting more serious, not less. We've seen it in the Horn of Africa. Part of the chaos in Syria was a result of persistent drought that drove people out of the countryside and into cities where ill-prepared. The situation we're going to be facing in Yemen. And I would say one area that I look forward to consulting with both of you is to see if we might be able to help focus the United States' efforts in Gaza. No matter what one thinks about the conflict there, we have almost 2 million people who are in an area that the water supply is not going to be, any of it, is going to be fit for human consumption within 2 years. And within less than 5 years, we think that that condition will become permanent. Maybe this is a little area that we could come together to try and deal in a humanitarian sense. But let me just stop at this point. The National Intelligence Estimate points out that this is a serious issue of national security. You've got some of the best people here. I appreciate your leadership and focus and look forward to being your partner, maybe not on the committee, but maybe as an honorary member of your team. Thank you so very much.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it is indeed an honor to join you, Chairman Rohrabacher, and I thank you for your leadership on this extremely important issue. And Mr. Blumenauer, it is a delight to be with you again, and thank you for your legislation, which did become law, which I think is a landmark piece of legislation. It was very bipartisan, but you walked point, and I thank you for that extraordinary leadership as well. Like you, Mr. Chairman, my subcommittee has had and held several hearings on health and water, and it is clear that without adequate supplies of clean drinking water and proper sanitation, no health programming can succeed. Indeed, the World Health Organization estimates that because of a lack of access to safe drinking water and sanitation, more than 14,000 people die daily from waterborne illnesses, which cause more than 1 billion cases of intestinal worms, 1.4 million child deaths each year from diarrhea, 860,000 child deaths each year from malnutrition, and 500,000 deaths from all age groups each year from malaria. I note parenthetically that I have introduced legislation that we are really pushing hard to enact about neglected tropical diseases. And it would really take that whole issue to a new realm of prioritization and backing. But again, without water and without trying to address water needs, all of those efforts are stymied, and of course that is integrated into our bill. It is troubling that so many people in the world do not have ready access to water. The UN has estimated that 2.6 billion people have gained access to safe drinking water over the last 25 years, but another 663 million continue to lack access as of this year. Nearly half of these people live in Africa, another fifth live in South Asia. As we know, the UN Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, included a target for access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. According to the UN, global goals for access for water are being met, but sanitation continues to be unmet. And of course, that is defined as having globally the proportion of people who are without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. So it was a movement in the right direction, but certainly not an achievement of universal access. Over the past 10 years, the U.S. government has spent $3.5 billion on water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH programming. Nevertheless, even after several water acts passed by Congress and great international effort to bring countries up to global WASH standards, U.S. programming still remains somewhat disjointed. According to the GAO study just being concluded, there is no uniform model that has been created for WASH programming. USAID was supposed to present a comprehensive plan for WASH programming this year, but none has been released as of this time. Even if a model program were to be made adaptable to each country, by now there should be some overall strategy for how to design a program, monitor its progress, and evaluate its outcomes. In too many countries in which USAID operates WASH programs, there is no comprehensive program. Monitoring is limited, and evaluation fails to adequately assess the statistics being provided by host governments. The human cost of failure to provide adequate WASH programming is too high to allow substandard programming to continue. We will hear that there has been progress made, and this is indeed promising, but there is more that must be done. And again, we have the experts here today to provide a roadmap to our committees as to how we should proceed. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now we have three witnesses. I will be introducing the three of them. We will have testimony, and then we'll have questions and answers for all three witnesses at the same time. Let me suggest to the witnesses, if you can summarize in 5 minutes, that'd be great, and give us more time to have a bit of a dialogue on this. We have three wonderful witnesses. As I say, John Oldfield is the CEO of WASH Advocates, and now I'm trying to guess again, water and sanitation health? Hygiene.
Hygiene. Yes. Health is a good guess, though.
Okay, there we go. Advocates, an organization dedicated to increasing the awareness of global WASH challenges and solutions. Previously, he founded two implementing nonprofit organizations and was with the National Academy of Sciences, where he researched science and technology policy. And next we have from my home county, Dennis Bilodeau, who is the Vice President of the Orange County Water District and was elected to his fourth term in 2012. He is a licensed civil and traffic engineer, holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of California at Irvine. And let me just note that we in Orange County are proud that we have what we believe is the most technologically sophisticated and up-to-date water system in the world. And we will let him describe that and the implications of that for these various countries that are facing a serious challenge. Dale Whittington is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering and City and Regional Planning. He is a member of the Technological Committee on the Global Water Partnership and has served as consultant on water and sanitation policies to the World Bank, USAID, and numerous other organizations. So we have some very, witnesses that are very impressive with their credentials, and may we proceed, Mr. Oldfield.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was pretty proud of my opening remarks here until I heard yours. It's going to be hard to beat that. I think I'm gratified that some of the certified smart people are up there as well. So thank you for yours. Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Meeks, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members, Mr. Blumenauer, for the opportunity to provide these brief remarks, which are a summary of my written statement. Thank you, before I begin, for your interest and your support for safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene programs throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America over the last at least decade. I also, before I continue, want to recognize and in fact applaud the U.S. civic organizations, religious groups, student clubs, corporations, academics, private philanthropists, nonprofits, and my fellow panelists, my fellow witnesses who are all working to solve this challenge with us today. Safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene are about, in its most simple terms, about the dignity and personal and economic security of human beings. A life without wash is a very difficult one. You may remember a situation 2 years ago where two young women were raped and murdered in Uttar Pradesh, India, raped and murdered on their way to go to the bathroom in a field at night. That story, actually, I think helped galvanize Congress to support the Water for the World Act that was referenced and to strengthen appropriations language. So thank you again for that. And as I was preparing this testimony, I also learned of an extraordinarily sad situation from my friends at Special Olympics in Nigeria. A 15-year-old girl with an intellectual disability was raped on her way to fetch water from a local river for her school, a state school for students with intellectual disabilities in southern Nigeria. Now, that girl, a Special Olympics athlete, faces challenges in life that most of us can hardly imagine. And a lack of safe drinking water should not be one of them. There are, in both of these situations, there are larger societal challenges involved. But if these women had safe drinking water in a private, safe place to go to the bathroom, their lives would undoubtedly be, or have been, more secure and more productive. Now, beyond these painful stories, there are hundreds of millions of women who spend far too much of their time and far too much of their income acquiring, as you've stated, just enough water to keep themselves and their families alive, if not actually healthy, on a daily basis. In 2015, hundreds of millions of women and girls are wasting their lives carrying water. You know, imagine what would each of us do if we had an extra 3 or 4 hours a day? How much more secure would we feel? How much more economically productive would we be? This is solvable. I think all three of you have said that. And Congress has been a key ally for well over a decade here. The Water for the Poor Act of 2005, of course, made safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene a priority of U.S. foreign policy. The Water for the World Act of 2014 further directs USAID to make WASH investments with the biggest contributions to global public health, alongside improved monitoring and evaluation, enhanced accountability, and decentralized ownership. This year, House appropriators reasserted congressional intent to prioritize WASH and its fundamental contributions to health and to the security of the world's poorest people. The appropriators wrote, "Access to adequate water, sanitation, and hygiene is a critical component of disease prevention, and a lack of access to toilets and adequate sanitation impacts women and girls in particular." The global WASH challenge is both an emerging threat and an emerging opportunity. For 10 years, Congress and both the Bush and the Obama administrations have provided bipartisan support, moving WASH efforts to what I considered to be the leading edge of foreign assistance reform by focusing on strengthening local capacity and increasing accountability across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. However, Congress can further improve human and economic security across the developing world and should, A, continue to provide strong oversight of these issues, B, increase the amount, the effectiveness, and the targeting of annual appropriations, C, seek additional leverage for U.S. taxpayer dollars through additional partnerships and innovative finance. D, make WASH a more prominent piece of our bilateral relationships with many countries. And E, prioritize water and sanitation, first of all, as an important sector in its own right, but secondly, as the foundation of long-lasting progress toward public health, conflict prevention, undernutrition, and economic development. Now, years ago, an early supporter of the Water for the Poor Act that became law in 2005 said, "It is the human condition that must be improved if national security is to be strengthened." You may recall that quote. Sitting here today, I see no better way to improve the human condition than by providing safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene to more families and communities across the globe, and I and many, many others are grateful for your continuing support. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher and Smith and members of the subcommittee. I am Dennis Bilodeau, and I appear before you today as an elected member of the Board of Directors of the Orange County Water District. I'm honored to appear before you to discuss global water scarcity. I'll summarize my statement and request it to be submitted into the formal hearing record. As background, the OCWD is located in the 48th Congressional District in Southern California. Yes. We provide groundwater to 19 cities and water agencies with a population of 2.4 million. OCWD has led the way in developing innovative water solutions across a range of technology and infrastructure. In the late 1980s, we recognized that to preserve our region's economic vitality, we needed to address groundwater depletion, seawater intrusion, and unreliable surface water supplies. We implemented an aggressive program to develop a water treatment process with our sister agency, which is the Orange County Sanitation District. This is called the Groundwater Replenishment System. This system takes treated wastewater from the Orange County Sanitation District, and when I say treated wastewater, I speak of sewage, and that would otherwise be discharged into the Pacific Ocean. It implements a three-step advanced treatment process that consists of microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet light with hydrogen peroxide. This treatment and purification process produces high-quality water that exceeds all state and federal drinking water standards and delivers enough water to serve 850,000 people with a production of 100 million gallons a day currently. When we think about global water supply needs and the ways in which to reduce tensions that arise from constrained potable water supplies and the ability to share experiences and promote collaboration is important. OCWD shares its knowledge in advanced water purification technology. For example, Singapore enhanced its water security using our experience and expertise. The country of Singapore has been principally reliant on water from Malaysia. With political differences between the nations and the expiration of long-term agreements for water transfers between Malaysia and Singapore, the Public Utility Board of Singapore was tasked with finding ways to make Singapore more water self-sufficient. The Singapore PUB reached out to us to learn about technology that our district was using to purify wastewater and put it back into the groundwater supplies. Water leaders from Singapore visited us to see what we were doing to recycle and purify wastewater and to see how we are communicating with the public to bolster public support for potable reuse. Working with us, Singapore developed both purified water, which they call New Water, and seawater desalination to diversify their portfolio of available water for sources for the drinking water system, as well as to protect against depletion of their reserves during drought or interruption of imported supplies. Singapore also built a secondary system to enable it to serve high purity water to its high-tech customers, such as wafer fabricators and circuit board manufacturers that require highly purified water. This system of water distribution helped to make Singapore a desirable place for valuable industrial customers and to help locate manufacturing facilities. In 2014, the Orange County Water District was presented with the Lee Kuan Yew Water Prize for our efforts towards solving the world's water problems by applying innovative technology solutions. We are proud to serve as a global water leader in the water industry. And at the same time, it is just a start. Greater investments must be made to implement similar projects around the world. We must continue to create opportunities for water experts to engage with one another and to exchange information to keep pushing the envelope and develop new and innovative solutions to global water problems. The Singapore-Orange County Water District collaboration is an example of how American technology transfer can lead to solutions for global water supply and quality needs for regions around the world. Again, the Orange County Water District greatly appreciates the subcommittee's decision to explore this important national and international water security matter. Thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Whittington.
Mr. Chairman, just by chance, I just got back from 7 weeks in Singapore and had the privilege of seeing these facilities that Dennis has just described. So everything he's saying is true here. I just was at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today on the role of improved water and sanitation services in avoiding conflict and building economic prosperity. I'd like to make 3 points in my testimony. First, there's good news from the public health field. Thanks in part to the efforts of the United States and the international community, childhood mortality rates are declining in developing countries, and the rate of decline is accelerating. And as we look ahead over the next few decades, economic growth should enable East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America to solve their water supply and sanitation problems, and thankfully, water-related mortality will be a thing of the past in these regions. The remaining challenges are going to be in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but even here, childhood diarrhea and mortality rates are falling rapidly. However, the economic benefits from investments in water and sanitation infrastructure consist of both health and non-health outcomes, and Dennis has just described some of the non-health outcomes in Singapore. There's a shift occurring in the relative magnitude of these two components, with the health benefits declining and the non-health benefits, such as time savings, increasing. The non-health related benefits of improved water services vary depending on location, but they can be surprisingly large and are often increasing. For example, in a recent study conducted in Kathmandu, Nepal, researchers at the Institute of Water Policy at the National University of Singapore found that from 2001 to 2014, the real cost, after adjusting for inflation, that households were incurring coping with water shortages and intermittent contaminated supplies actually doubled from $7 a month to $14 a month on average. These coping costs include the value of time spent collecting water from outside the home, investments in water storage, in-house water treatment, and expenditures to water vendors, all of which most Americans never experience. Investments in improved water services that reduce or eliminate these coping costs free up a household's time, just as John just mentioned, and money for other priorities and increase economic growth. It's really hard for an urban economy to function efficiently if everyone is worried about getting home from work to meet a tanker truck in order to have sufficient water for a week. I think that this shift from health to non-health benefits has important implications for donor assistance in the WASH sector. In places where coping costs are high, one can be confident that the economic benefits of improved water supplies will also be very high. But the coping costs are not high everywhere, and careful economic analysis of water and sanitation infrastructure projects is needed to ensure that assistance is targeted to communities where it will have the greatest economic impact. This will also go a large way to reducing conflict. The best way to avoid conflict is for a country to get on a high-growth development path. My second point is that the world's population is becoming increasingly urbanized, and the largest economic benefits of improved water and sanitation infrastructure usually will be in cities in developing countries. So if the objective is to promote economic growth, then it's important to prioritize investments in urban areas. Large economic benefits can be obtained not only from infrastructure investment, but also from policy reforms. Utilities in cities and low and middle income countries almost always provide water and sanitation services to customers far below cost. They rely on subsidies from higher level governments and donors to pay these subsidies. And recent research has shown that these subsidies are very poorly targeted. The majority don't reach poor households. For my third point, I want to shift from the economic benefits of water and sanitation investments to the relationship between water and conflict on international rivers. I know the subcommittee has heard from Paul Sullivan and his testimony on the implications of the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. However, I've been studying and writing about the Nile for almost 40 years, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions you have about the situation that's emerging on the Nile. I'd like to just say a few last things and comments on that situation. The construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam started in 2011 on the Blue Nile near the Ethiopian-Sudanese border. It's now about 40% complete. When it's finished, the Nile riparians and the global community will face a new situation in transboundary hydropolitics. There will be two very large dams, the Aswan High Dam and the GERD, with over-year storage capacity on the same river in different countries in a water-scarce basin, and there's presently no plan for coordinating the operation of those large storage facilities. In my judgment, the Nile riparians need assistance from the international community immediately in reaching a fair, equitable agreement on the joint operation of the Aswan High Dam and the GERD based on best global practices. This is a matter of urgency. Ethiopia will likely begin filling the GERD in 2016, just next year. So in summary, I have 4 recommendations. First, in order to promote economic growth, assistance in the water supply and sanitation sector should be focused on South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and on cities. Second, if USAID wants water and sanitation investments with high economic returns, it should assist countries to do the economic analysis to identify where economic returns will be greatest. President Reagan's executive order 12291 required that all major regulations in the United States pass a cost-benefit test. Why not have USAID assistance to the water sector pass a similar test? Third, the United States Agency for International Development's Global Water Coordinator and the Department of State Special Advisor for Water Resources should give high priority to the reform of municipal water pricing and tariffs in developing countries and to improve the targeting of available subsidies to poor households. And finally, fourth, the United States Department of State should encourage international organizations such as the World Bank to re-engage in the Nile mission. As I said, this is a matter of urgency for the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by Dan Donovan. Do you have any opening statement you'd like to make before we go into some questions?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I will proceed with my time period here. First, let's note about Orange County. I bring people in from all over the world. I must have, in the last 10 years, brought in 20 or 30 different groups of people from foreign countries to see the operation that's going down there. And it's based on, yes, 2 elements. One is a new technology, with this membrane technology being developed to the utmost, but also it deals with the cooperation of various levels of government and, as you say, the sanitation department and the water district. I don't know if sanitation and water districts get along at other places, but from what I understand, sometimes it's hard for one department of government to talk to the other department of government, whether it's federal, state, or local. So, but just as they're doing that, we need to make sure that at the federal level, we are cooperating between the various departments and agencies that can have an impact on this issue. And we've already drawn attention to the fact that when you have so many people who are facing a future with billions of people without, or a billion people, without clean water, that is a volatile situation where people are seeing their families die and thus undermine the security and the tranquility of whatever area that's going on. And for all we know, and I haven't looked at it yet, but I would hope to find out about it, that some of these refugees that are pouring into Europe right now and creating an enormous chaos that Europe just has not been used to I would say that there probably is a water connection there, and several of our witnesses have alluded to that. So when our European friends talk about what can be done to help prevent that, number one, let's make sure people aren't watching their children die of some disease that wouldn't be there if they had clean water, and thus they don't feel compelled about taking their entire family and going to Europe where they think they can get clean water. Let me ask this. Has there been a assessment where we're talking about trying to have some kind of real assessment as to how effective a program is? Is this a lacking? Maybe you could go into a little more detail on that.
It's hard to do economic analysis of water projects because it's difficult to measure all these benefits. At the same time, I think we have to try. I mean, the World Bank does it, the Inter-American Development Bank does it, and I think USA can do it too. Warren Buffett doesn't get high returns on capital just by chance. I mean, he does the economic analysis to figure that out. And I think it's the same in the water sector. I mean, there are lots of good investments everywhere, but we should be focusing our taxpayer dollars on those investments with the highest economic returns. And you have to do the economic analysis to figure that out.
And one question for the panel, and just very quickly. We had the example of Singapore, where you have this huge number of people with a very limited amount of water, and now it's clean water and they're prospering. Is this an urban challenge, or are we talking about a more of a development challenge in terms of clean water? Just go down the row there.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a fair question. We've read the demographic data. 51% of the world now lives in cities, in urban and peri-urban or informal settlement environments. So I'd certainly second Dr. Whittington's suggestion to focus on cities to a certain extent. But the data also shows that 70 to 75% of the remaining problem, 70 to 75% of the 663 million people without access to safe drinking water, the 2.4 billion people without a private, safe place to go to the bathroom, are in rural communities. They are in.
Could you please repeat that statistic that you just gave us?
70 to 75% of the remaining need for safe drinking water and sanitation across the developing world is in rural communities, across Africa, across Asia, and across Latin America. Now, that is changing. People are migrating to cities and informal settlements around cities and so on. So the need is pervasive everywhere. I think what ties this all together is what I think the three of you said in your opening statements. We know how to solve this. And regardless if it's urban, peri-urban, or rural villages in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, we know how to solve these problems. They know how to solve these problems. And they need to be solved in a fashion that's both appropriate in technical terms, in financial terms, and in sociocultural terms. And these problems need to be solved in a fashion that's resilient, that's going to build systems that are able to withstand population shifts, droughts, floods, and so on. So the systems, whether it's urban, peri-urban, or rural, need to be both appropriate in a number of terms, a number of facets of appropriate and resilient.
In terms of the Orange County experience, the technology we're using is primarily applicable to urbanized areas because you need to have a central collection point for the wastewater that then you can then harvest and reuse that water and deliver it back out to your customers. So it wouldn't be so applicable in sparsely populated areas, but definitely for urbanized areas. And our type of system would go hand in hand in terms of development of a sewage collection system as well as a recycling system along with that.
So what you've got is sanitation and clean water, again.
Combined.
The importance of putting those two together.
Yes, developing those in conjunction.
So I agree with John that there are huge problems in rural areas, but I think that there's a tension between humanitarian aid and pro-growth economic aid. I'm not arguing to do less in rural areas. I just want to focus also on urban areas, because that's where the economic benefits and the real chance to move economies to a high growth dynamic trajectory is. And so as people move from rural areas into cities, there's a package of infrastructure investments that are critical to getting economic growth moving. And they include telecommunications and roads and health and education. And water is a critical component. The piped water services in urban areas are what people want. People in developing countries are just like you. They want 24/7 water that's potable, that they can drink. And this is feasible, and it's not only feasible from a humanitarian point of view, it's the right thing to do from an economic development perspective.
And of course, the cleaner water in the urban area, the less money has to be spent for taking care of people's health problem. An investment in the water would negate some of that cost. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all three for your very, very expert and informative presentations. Let me just ask Dr. Whittington, you've made 4 recommendations. Thank you for those. I think they're right on the money and in terms of things we should be doing. When you talk about the GERD and the Aswan High Dam and the status of the negotiations, my question is, what might a prudent agreement look like? I mean, the time seems to be, coming and quickly passing. I mean, as you pointed out, filling of the dam might begin as early as 2016. You talk about the U.S. Department of State should increase its diplomatic efforts. What is it doing? How engaged are we? How would you rate it? Is it enough? Is it something we should invite State and USAID to be here to, give us some insights, and maybe we could prod them along to try to make this much more serious. The GAO study has said USAID WASH interventions don't cover large water issues such as dams, as you know. So if you could just give some information or some guidance along those lines. With regards to sanitation, perhaps one of you, Mr. Oldfield, perhaps you might want to provide insights and recommendations as to why the international community has failed to meet the MDG targets for sanitation. And even meeting those targets for the accessibility to clean and safe water, we're talking about halving the number of those who don't have access, and that still leaves us, as you know, with over 663 million people who have lacked access to safe water. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's certainly not the achievement of the hope is, which would be universal access. But why is sanitation a laggard? And let me also ask, in Africa, if it accelerates as it is, its march to electrification via Power Africa and other initiatives, how should these emerging economies integrate best practices? And perhaps our friend from Orange County might speak to that. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, you have invited delegations from other countries to go and witness what they're doing, to share that best practice. But is our government integrating the experts in the field like yourself so that, Nigeria, Ethiopia, name the country, could say, why reinvent the wheel? This has been perfected to the point, and now that we have access to electricity that we hadn't had before, that state-of-the-art sanitation can be deployed in a way that provides for safety and efficacy of the whole operation. So if you could speak to that, because it seems to me we've written the book on this. We've done this on a whole lot of other issues. We learned from others, but we also, as a country, and I think Europe can say the same thing, has much to share. But if we're not actively integrating that sharing process, you are, but can it be accelerated? Should it be accelerated? And if you could speak to that.
Okay, I'll go first. In terms of our experience, we're fortunate that we have very highly qualified engineering companies, private companies, that actually designed and built our facilities for us. The companies are multinational, so they of course can go to Singapore, or there's another plant similar to Singapore's in Kuwait that General Electric actually built there and operates it currently. So in terms of exporting the technology, it's really the American corporations that are leading the way and that have the engineering skill and know-how in terms of the design and in the construction. In terms of at our facility, one thing that we've lended our expertise to is we do a lot of pilot testing of new technologies. There's a new technology called graphene that is in research and development right now that may revolutionize reverse osmosis membranes and bring the cost of reverse osmosis treatment down substantially. And so that's something we're working with Lockheed currently in bench testing basically their innovation and trying to bring the cost of treating this water down, which of course will help to export this technology around the world and for other applications around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Oldfield.
Great. Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman, about sanitation and the MDGs. There's no easy answer to why the world missed by such a significant amount the Millennium Development Goal for sanitation. I'll try in about 10 seconds here. Lack of political will, not just in this country, certainly not just in this country, but more importantly in developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Simply a lack of political prioritization and a lack of financial resources, primarily from developing countries, for sanitation. And then in some places where these things did come together, I would use India as an example that made a significant commitment to sanitation throughout 2000 to 2015. There was an imbalance between hardware and software. They built a whole lot of toilets and didn't do the behavior change. They built a lot of hardware and didn't have a lot of software to back that up. So all of a sudden, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world, you have toilets used for unintended purposes. If I might take 10 seconds to address the flip side of that, which is how we're going to address the Sustainable Development Goals commitment to universal coverage of sanitation by 2013, it's exactly the opposite. Increased political commitment and prioritization for sanitation, appropriate sanitation solutions so that all 7+ billion of us have a place to go to the bathroom on the planet. Political leaders, and I don't mean sanitation ministers or water ministers, I mean prime ministers, finance ministers, heads of state and heads of government need to prioritize this, and that's something that we're trying to work on a bit. And therefore increased financial support for sanitation primarily from developing countries themselves. There are a lot of efforts within USAID and up on Capitol Hill to figure out how to best address this concept of domestic resource mobilization, DRM. How can we help mobilize more public and private resources for development challenges, including sanitation, not from this country, not from the international donor community, but from developing countries themselves. So more political will, more particularly public sector finance. I think we need to redress this imbalance around the world between hardware and software. We need to focus on changing behavior, on changing minds. Then the hardware problems will solve themselves, I think. If everybody wants a toilet, the public or the private sector is going to come up with a way to make sure that every single one of those people has a toilet. And then lastly, echoing your concerns, that I haven't seen anything about this GAO audit yet, but from what you've shared with us very briefly, I think I would agree with their concerns. What I'd like to see, not just in the sanitation space, but in the entire WASH space, is modernizing foreign assistance network principles of foreign assistance reform, increased accountability, increased capacity, decentralized ownership, and increased transparency throughout our foreign assistance. Thank you.
Just on that point, do you believe the political will is emerging, is there perhaps to have universal access to adequate sanitation by 2030, pursuant to the post-2015 goals?
I do, whether you mean in the developed world or in the developing world. I think that, I mean, this hearing is a manifestation of increased political will for sanitation in developing countries from the United States as one member of the international donor community. The Dutch government's doing a fantastic job with this, the British government, the German government. We have a lot of allies in our renewed focus on sanitation. But again, more importantly than that, we're seeing a lot of increased efforts to prioritize sanitation in developing countries. And the one example I would give you is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's commitment to Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, a Clean India campaign. A year ago, he committed to universal coverage of sanitation in India by October 2nd, 2019, Mahatma Gandhi's 150th birthday. He is committed to ending open defecation and providing a toilet and making sure it's used for its intended purpose to all of India's 1.25 billion citizens within a very, very short period of time. One example of heightened political will.
Thank you. Dr.
So I'll go back to your questions about the Nile, and I think there were two. What would an agreement look like, and what is the State Department doing? They're both great questions. And what would an agreement look like if you go to the Murray-Darling in Australia, or you go to the Colorado, where you have large over-year storage facilities on big rivers and water-scarce areas? Those agreements are hundreds of pages long. So the first thing is, this is not an easy task. I mean, somebody has to actually write these agreements and negotiate these agreements, and that takes time, and it needs to start very quickly. Technically, what has to happen in the agreement is that Ethiopia is going to be filling the GERD reservoir, but they've got to pass enough water down to Sudan and Egypt during that time so that those countries can meet their essential needs. Egypt has the S1 high dam, so they can buffer this a little bit if they have storage in the high dam. Sudan does not. There's no over-year storage in Sudan. So there has to be enough water passed to meet the essential needs of Egypt and Sudan during the filling. But more importantly, in the long run, there needs to be coordinated management on the droughts, because that's where the real conflict could come. If Ethiopia wants to hold back water on the droughts, and that water is really needed downstream in Sudan and Egypt. So this is not hard to do technically, but it has to be negotiated. And so the key point on the agreement that we're missing right now, we don't have an agreement, but that we also need a trustworthy, binding arbitrator. And that's where I think the global community can come in. I would say that the State Department's active. Aaron Salzberg, the Special Advisor on Water, has been working hard. But I think the visibility of this issue really needs to rise. There has not been a coordinated international response on this. It's not just a U.S. concern. It's a concern for Europe and the World Bank. The World Bank has moved back from the Nile. They're not as engaged as they were in the past. And I think this has to change.
Thank you.
Just one thought before we go to Mr. Blumenauer. Cairo, Egypt, do we know how many times it reuses its water? I don't. In many of these countries that we're talking about, they don't reuse it at all. They just use it once and it goes into the ocean. In Orange County, California, how many times do we reuse our water and clean it and reuse it and clean it and reuse it before it goes back into the ocean?
Well, now it's infinite. It's dozens of times. We continually reprocess the water that comes to us.
So at least 9, 10 times.
Yes.
We are reusing that water, we're purifying it again, and then reusing it. And in countries like Egypt, or on the edge of the desert, this could mean everything. And especially if you end up with a war or something between someone upstream and downstream, as compared to just making sure the water you are using, you reuse it over and over again. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. And again, I appreciate the courtesy in permitting me to join the panel. Dr. Winnington, you mentioned coping costs and cited a study in Nepal, Kathmandu, where they have doubled to being $14 per
household per month.
Per household per month. In a nation with a per capita income per household,
Gosh, you got me there. I think
$600, $800?
yeah, it's around 1,000, I think.
it
But
1,000?
I have to check. Yeah, but it's a good question. I mean, these may not seem like big numbers to you, but for poor people in developing countries, these are high costs. And when households save this money, and as John said, save the time, these can be put to more productive uses and start a country on a path to, economic growth. But it's really hard to do that if you're spending all your time, scrambling around a big city trying to figure out how to get water for your family.
Well, it struck me, that seems like a very high number to me, thinking about what happens in these developing countries. And it raises the point, I think we're looking at the number I've heard quoted, 155 million hours a day is spent by women and girls, often, as Mr. Oldfield points out, putting themselves at risk to secure water for the families, often dirty water. They end up in many developing countries paying a huge amount of their disposable income, to say nothing of money that's not being spent. I'm wondering if you, Doctor, or actually any the members of the panel would care to comment on our capacity to actually self-fund much of what needs to be done if we're able to get an early intervention, maybe help a little bit of capital expenditure, help a little bit with the planning and development, and as our chairman says, where there are some pretty fundamental areas of savings that aren't being employed. You want to talk about the potential of self-funding this if we do it
It's a great
right?
question, and actually water.org is doing just this right now with microfinancing water projects in developing countries. So they're putting money into communities, they're borrowing and then repaying those loans to get sustainable, high-quality water and sanitation services. So I think your point's exactly right. Where coping costs are high, and those savings are real, in dollars and time, there's great opportunities for self-financing water and sanitation projects.
Yeah, if I might add 30 seconds of that, I'd ask you to consider taking a look at USAID's recent Safeguarding the World's Water report. I was looking at it in preparing for this hearing, looking for success stories of how water contributes to economic prosperity. I'd highlight the Partnerships Office, the Development Innovation Ventures team at USAID has recently provided financial support to a group called Sanergy. It's a sort of front-end catalytic financial support that you're talking about, Mr. Blumenauer, and the Sanergy then takes these funds, franchises toilets to entrepreneurs outside of Kenya who collect the waste, turn it into organic, natural fertilizer, and make a profit, I think it's per toilet, of up to $2,000 US a year. And several of these entrepreneurs have much more than one toilet, so it's a real business opportunity. I'd highlight USAID's SUWASA, the Sustainable Water and Sanitation in Africa program as well, which is not just focused on one technology or one business or financial model, but doing what it can to promote various commercial solutions and financial sustainability. It's the sort of, I won't get into too much detail on this right now, but it's the sort of, I think, catalytic front-end financial and technical assistance that the U.S. taxpayer, through its trustees, through their trustees, and through USAID should be providing. We should be first in, not last out. We should be the catalyst, not the one running around with a used drilling rig, drilling wells. And that's my take. I think we get a much bigger bang for the taxpayer dollar with programs like that.
Yes, and briefly, I agree with Mr. Oldfield in that the USAID has led the way in terms of the international financing. In our case, our entire program has cost $600 million to build. Much of that was financed by ourselves and some help from the state of California, and also we received $20 million from the Title 16 program. But we provide water for 850,000 people now with our system, and so you can understand the economies of scale there and the metrics.
Thank you. It is part of what we've attempted to do in the more recent reform legislation is to focus on investments that the United States is involved with that are more sustainable, not using inappropriate technology or getting people started and then they don't have the wherewithal to continue with it. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that as a result of some of this conversation, there would be an opportunity to do a little deeper analysis of what we can do on the ground to help provide the foundation, because done right, it seems to me clear, the evidence is that we can have programs that are actually affordable if they get over that initial hurdle in terms of understanding the technology, maybe having a little upfront financing, maybe not even grants, but financing, that there's enough money involved with some of these really, in some cases, tragic conditions that we could make a big difference.
We do plan a second and probably third hearing on this issue in which we will be covering exactly the type of areas you're suggesting.
Great. Thank you very much.
And now we have Mr. Dan Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm the newest member of this committee. I've been in Congress for 4 months. I don't want you to get confused. This is my first time sitting on the upper tier. I'm usually down there by where it says staff only. So this is my first exposure.
Don't get used to it.
Thank you, Chairman. This is my first exposure to your expertise, to the probing questions of my colleagues. My understanding of the issue is just what I've read over the years. So my limited understanding, and more general, is that the problem is caused by droughts. It's caused by having adequate water, but it's not safe water. There's safe water that's adequate for people, but there's not infrastructure to get it to people. It's regimes or governments who have adequate water and infrastructure but won't allow their people access to it. Are these the problems that you're facing, that these countries that you're talking about are facing, and is our country doing its share or enough to help? To anyone?
Well, thank you, Mr. Donovan. I think the easy answer to your question is yes. It's all of the above. Name a challenge associated with safe drinking water, sanitation, or hygiene, and people are facing it. Sometimes it's a lack of water, but I guess I would quote an academic named Hans Rosling, who said, "The biggest environmental challenge on the planet today is that 1 billion people are drinking their neighbor's lukewarm feces." These people are not dying of thirst. They're dying of shit in the water. They are drinking each other's feces, and that's what's killing 500,000 children minimum each year. The flip side of your question is that this is solvable. The folks at this table, the folks up on the dais there, understand how to solve this problem. I believe that the U.S. government is doing a lot. I think, you heard the figure of $3.5 billion for water and sanitation programs over the last 10, 12 years. That's a lot. I personally am up here to advocate that we can do not just more, but that we can do better by addressing some of the concerns that Chairman Smithe brought up earlier about how to build local capacity, how to decentralize ownership, how to make sure that we're actually working ourselves out of a job, not create further dependencies in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. And I'd be happy in your first year here to spend some more time with you or your staff on this to bring you up to speed. And I'd also direct you to Mr. Blumenauer's office and to Mr. Poe's office, who were the key sponsors of the Water for the World Act last year.
Yes, and briefly, as he mentioned, the key is that many of these areas are lacking proper sanitation facilities. The sanitation facility is essentially the river. And if we can help developing countries develop proper sanitation facilities in concert with water reuse facilities, it sort of it solves two problems simultaneously.
I'll just tell you about a puzzle that we have in the sector. We have a lot of non-piped technologies that work and are cheap, they're effective, they save lives. But household demand for these services is often low. On the other hand, household demand for pipe services, 24/7 water supply, potable water, like you've got, is very high. But the problem is these are very expensive, and they're very capital intensive. So, those are the two kind of things that we wrestle with in this sector. And it gets back to this issue of financing. How do we finance, improved pipe systems for urban areas to promote growth and dynamic economies? I mean, that's, to me, is one of the real challenges we face. We know how to save lives, and we should do it, with cheap, cost-effective technologies. But people want more than that, and they want economic growth, and they want the convenience of piped water in their homes. And So that's the challenge that we struggle with in the sector, or one of the challenges we struggle with. The other thing I'd say about struggling, water problems are local. And solving them requires local capacity, local institutions, and local expertise. So one of the challenges we've got is building local capacity, building local institutions, because the solutions are not the same everywhere. So it's an educational task that we've got, an institutional building task, and we all know those are really hard.
I thank you all for your enlightenment. I yield the rest of my time, Chairman.
And last but not least, Mr. Clausen.
Thank you for coming today, y'all. I've got two questions or comments that I'd like y'all to respond to, so I'll throw them out one at a time. So my district is, the southern tip is Marcos Island. I got the west tip of the Everglades, go up north along the coast, Naples, Bonita Springs, Fort Myers, Cabbage Key. Great place, right? I think I got the best district of all. Wonderful, welcoming people, and I love it there. That's another conversation. I'm always concerned about diseases from mosquitoes that come from water because we don't do well with drainage and pooling. And I'm worried about that personally because, you know, I see chikungunya right around the corner. I see dengue fever right around the corner. It's all over the Caribbean. Far south is Brazil. And, you know, it just feels like it's knocking on our door, and it's just a question of time. And I'm always worried about how we do with, you know, I drive around my district, I'm looking at all that pool and water, and I compare that to the developing world where they don't do anything, particularly if it's a bad rainy season, and then you got 10% of the population of the world gets dengue fever, chikungunya is blowing up everywhere. We have this conversation today, and until now, I don't think anybody's even brought it up. And I think of Southeast Asia and the rainy seasons there in India, and, you know, look, I'm all with you on toilets and wells, but it feels like part of the global conversation about water sanitation and usability is behind the curve with respect to mosquitoes, because we beat malaria, which is a nocturnal, rural problem, and now we have chikungunya and dengue fever, which is a urban daytime problem. So that's number one. And do we, as a country and as a globe, do we do any work on that? Second thing is to Mr. Oldfield's comments. My experience in development in South America and Southeast Asia is that if folks are at risk a little bit, skin in the game on the well or on the toilet, you know, the septic system, however basic it is, that they tend to keep it up more, and that a lot of the 500,000 that are dying every year, you know, I'm a lot more open-minded to spending taxpayer money if the end user has skin in the game. And that's not a conservative's way of saying I don't want to help, because we've all spent a big chunk of our life trying to help. But if the model makes everyone in the supply chain have skin in the game, then I think, you know, what I have seen is that we have better usage of the money. So I would just ask y'all's quick response to my two comments. First of all, if you think I'm all wet on the mosquito thing, just tell me right up, and then Mr. Oldfield, you can comment on the other one.
I don't think all wet was what you really wet. Okay.
I don't think you're all wet on dengue. I think it's a serious concern. I would say that there has been rapid progress on a dengue vaccine, and I would get ready to use it. You need to be ready to deploy that in your district when it's.
I'm really glad you look. If you can Dr. Winningham, if you ever have time even for a conference call with my team, we'd love to hear that. I read it a year or two ago that they're working on a vaccine in Singapore or in Asia somewhere. I assume it's from outside the U.S., is that
Yeah,
right?
it is outside the U.S. International Vaccine Institute in Seoul has made great progress on this, and some of the pharmaceuticals, and so I would be happy to talk to your staff
And
about this.
does it work on all 4 strains of dengue fever, or?
You know, you got me on that. But they're very happy about the preliminary results from the trials on this. So that's something that I would get ready to use.
We are very interested because we see ourselves right behind the keys in terms of.
I just mentioned I got back from Singapore, and they're monitoring very closely dengue cases when they pop up. They send people in to figure out where it came from, and they're really trying hard to stay on top of mosquito control. But I think your concern is exactly right. I mean, this is a real risk, and
Yeah, my guys tell me the type of mosquito that spreads dengue is there, but he hasn't. The infection is not yet in South Florida. So, it just feels like a question of time before we and I am going to be dealing with this. And if we can see it coming,
I think you're right.
okay.
So your second point was about wells and skin in the game, and I also agree completely with you on that point. And it relates back to the other question about financing and microfinance and getting people to pay for these services as well. I would say that from my perspective, competition in this business is useful, and one of the great advances, or one of the best things that's happened in sub-Saharan Africa in the last couple decades in the wash sector has actually been the presence of Chinese contractors competing for contracts in the rural water sector, and they really halved the price of wells. So the price of drilling wells, an old technology, it didn't, we've been having wells around for 5,000 years, but the Chinese contractors have come in, competed in a market-based system for those contracts to drill wells in rural areas, and have won contracts and cut the price in half. So there's a market in this business that
My experience in this is that when we do the financial calculation, the return, either net present value or IRR, we leave out the cost avoidance of hepatitis C or the other things that bad toilets cause, and therefore developing countries understate the return on investment for proper sanitation. Am I right about that? Mr. Oldfield, maybe.
Well, I think that's right, and I would just add time savings to that. I mean, I think once you factor in the 3, 4, 6 hours a day that a lot of these women around Africa, Asia, and Latin America spend hauling water contaminated with human feces on their heads, pretty much every wash project is financially viable. And I know that doesn't satisfy you from an NPV or an IRR perspective.
No, I think
but
if
it
you
needs
take
to be
cost
factored in
avoidance
there,
in
too.
your, no, I disagree. I mean, I think if you take cost avoidance in and the cost of ringworm and everything else that goes with bad water, I mean, I'm conservative, but I'm right with you all on that. I mean, I think the financial models, if we take all aspects into account, first of all, saving people's lives, which is always more important, then I'm right with you. But I think that if we ignore the cost avoidance, and if we leave the end user out of the risk stream, then we come up with corruption and other problems. Do you agree with me on that, Mr. Oldfield, or not?
Well, I do. I think you're on the right track here, and I'm constantly looking for more ways to justify. My job is to encourage Americans, both public and private, to do more and better in tackling the world's WASH challenge, water, sanitation, and hygiene. One of our key messages is that every dollar invested in WASH it provides a $4 return according to the World Health Organization, and that $4 in return, it's not a financial return, it's barely an economic return. What it is it's a social return. Most of that comes from increased, well, I guess it's economic ROI, increased economic productivity because of extra hours in your day. But a significant percentage of that 4-to-1 ROI does come from decreased healthcare costs as well. But it's not an emerging field, but there's new research coming out on this all the time because it is, exactly as you said, it's awfully difficult to quantify precisely.
Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses today. This is, again, second in a series of hearings that we will have on water. And some of the areas
that have been outlined by Mr. Blumenauer, we're going to be looking at. And we want to, I think that we've really opened up an area of discussion on policy that could be of great value and accomplish some things that in a very cost-effective way. So I want to thank you for helping start this dialogue on water, and we will continue in the next hearing, but this one is adjourned.